Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Kai Koenig, and he's joining us from New Zealand, where it's just after 6 a.m., which is very dedicated of him to the ColdFusion community. And we're going to be talking about some tools for improving your ColdFusion code quality. And we'll look at why does code quality matter and what it means in practice. And we'll look at some different things you can do to measure your code quality without running the code. And also examine why there are more tools in other languages than CFML in this field and what Kai is doing to remedy this with the CF Lint project. And we'll dig into that in a bit more detail. And if you haven't met Kai, he's been in the ColdFusion community for nearly 20 years now. I think I met him out at a CF Europe event many years ago. And he works for Vertigo Creative in Wellington, New Zealand. And he does a whole bunch of things from ColdFusion to Flex to Java, all kinds of stuff. Maybe we'll talk about that a bit later. So welcome, Kai.
Welcome, Michael. Thanks a lot for having me. Good morning.
Yes, good. Well, evening for me, but morning for you. Yeah. So let's just start off, because people may not have thought about this at all. Why does code quality matter?
Because in reality, when you write code, I mean, regardless what language or what technology you're using, you're usually writing code that lives quite a long time. And what that means is, like, you might have to go back to your code in, I don't know, a few weeks, a few months, a few years. And all of a sudden you look at that and you would think like, well, who wrote that? Until you look at, the Git or Mercurial logs or the annotations for that line of code, and you figure out, oh, it was me 2 years ago, bugger. And I mean, that is really the simplest explanation why code quality matters. You want to always ideally produce code that can be maintained, that can be looked at and understood in a couple of years or months later at least. And that is well documented and that just makes sense. And that really, is code quality to some extent, or a very high level description of code quality.
And presumably it reduces the number of bugs in your code as well.
Well, yeah, that's kind of a welcome side effect of that, right? I mean, and depending on how exactly you define code quality for you or for your team, or how you define a good code quality, that could mean that, you basically say, I run certain tools against my code and I expect, let's say all unit tests to pass, or, less than 1% of unit tests to fail, or certain code checking rules to be, okay, or again, within a certain threshold of being successfully checked. And yeah, side effect of that is usually you have less bugs or less problems in your code, not necessarily bugs, but just things that don't look right. And I mean, that's another thing, we could talk about, like code smells. You look at some code of yourself or, by someone else, and you think like, oh, something is not quite right with that code. And that usually means something is actually not quite right.
Yeah, I wrote a whole blog post on code smell, so I'll link that in ColdFusion. I'll link that into the show notes. But code smell is basically some rules of thumb that the code is off. Is that how you're using the term, or?
Yeah, I guess that's about right. I mean, it's more, I would probably say it's that gut feeling that something is not okay. And I mean, sure, people have tried to put that into, like rules, like what are bad smells, basically, in code or in architecture as well. You don't have to, go down that semi-formal path. Sometimes it's literally, good enough to just look at something and think like, yeah, that's not okay. And then you dig deeper and you find a whole flurry of problems coming from that.
Mm.
I just recently looked at some code that was throwing crazy errors in an application log file.
Mm-hmm.
And that was on production, and no one actually ever monitored that particular log file.
Oh.
And so we looked into the code that was kind of producing that error. And turns out that was actually an error that was masking a whole bunch of other problems. So we took that kind of CF error and try catch stuff out of the code, and all of a sudden hell breaks loose, that kind of thing. It's like, okay, that is a serious problem here, right? And sometimes you find those things, you just look at a basic little thing that is kind of off, and all of a sudden you uncover, actually a big issue.
Yeah, it's sort of like dealing with cockroaches in a house. If you've ever lived in the south of the United States, you lift up a little cardboard thing and there's a few cockroaches there, and then you lift something else and there's a whole zoo of cockroaches.
Yeah. People with rodents will say, you can see a mouse or a rat in your house, and that's actually bad, because then there are like probably 50 others.
Yeah. So, and that's why I've always liked the idea that if you're getting errors from your application, and maybe you're getting them emailed or notified some other way, the goal is to get 0 errors, and you don't leave errors collecting in error logs without dealing with them, because like you said earlier, they could be hiding other more serious things underneath, even if they themselves are not important.
Yeah, fully agree.
So and I guess one of the things that's part of this is code complexity. Is that one of the things you look for when you're? Yeah,
code complexity plays into the whole architecture of an application, right? And what you can say from a general point of view, language independent, is if you have an over complex application, it usually leads to kind of an architecture situation where it's hard to understand what's going on like, a higher level even. So you look at like an overall solution and you think like, I have no idea what is happening here. And that can have different reasons, right? In ColdFusion, for example, what you see quite often with high complexity situations is it's old code. So someone has written an application in CF maybe 10, 15 years ago, and it's in that typical spaghetti kind of mode, right? So you have like pretty much like individual pages that are kind of linked together, and all the pages are doing their own thing, and some of them have logic embedded into the HTML page. Nothing is kind of split out into different like areas of concern. And the application itself, or what it's doing, would not necessarily be complex, but the way how it's written, even a simple thing, leads to this whole cycle of dependencies and things going back and forth, and some logic being here and some other logic being down there. And that's kind of like, difficult to deal with.
And in the ideal case, the original developer threw some global variables in that get randomly changed deep inside the code.
Yeah. The funny thing is, right, like you find those problems in other technologies as well, right? I mean, if developers do that, they can do those bad things in any language. So I do, I also do a lot of Android work nowadays. So we use Java and Kotlin to build Android apps. And sometimes you see like crazy things in this field as well. And you would think like, well, Java is a more formal language and it is a static language, and like, the community of Java developers is maybe more mature than the ColdFusion community in some ways, but it's not. If you want to abuse a language and a technology, you can do it in any language, basically. That's just like one of those universal truths, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Is one of the other things how the variables or functions are named? Is that another sign of code quality, or?
Yeah, that can be, basically. If you have scenarios where you have a class, or in ColdFusion, maybe a CFC, and that has 200 functions. And they're all, they might even be well named, but if you have 200 functions in one kind of class or complex or component, then that points to that being a problem potentially as well.
But if they're called A1, A2, A3, or some other silly naming, I've seen things like that. It's like,
Oh yeah, totally. And that's clearly not good. A function should always be named and in a way that it can easily explain by naming what it's doing, at least roughly. Right? get
Yeah.
something, or save data in XML, or whatever you want to come up with, but certainly
Right.
not A1, A2, A3.
Yeah. And, sometimes people go a bit crazy on the opposite end. They have a name that looks like, it's got 30 different verb pieces in it. Reminds me of trying to read German many years ago. But
German has a lot of long words, yeah.
Yeah. And nothing against the German language, but, if you're programming and you have a function name that goes on off the side of the page, that's also not good for code quality.
Yeah, I find that quite a bit in testing in particular. So when people write unit test functions, quite often there is the tendency to come up with really long function names for those unit tests, like test get data from database under the circumstance of A equals 0 and struct is empty, and then you end up with function names that are super long, and that even if you use camel case, if you use underscores between the words, it's really, really hard to read.
Yeah, and that's maybe part of the basis of good code quality. Is the code easy to read and understand?
Yeah, that is a fair comment, I think, but that's a very individual judgment to make, right? Like what you might find easy to read and understand, I might say this is still not good enough, or vice versa. Or we might have totally different expectations about basic things like how is code indented. I mean, that always causes a lot of discussion, right? Or where do you put curly braces? Do you put them on the end of the line, or do you put them in the next line, right? And I mean, developers are funny creatures, right? We are basically very individual, and each of us thinks the way how we do things is right. And the best way.
And I think for if you're used to putting braces or whatever other feature in a certain way, you kind of, when you read through the code, you're looking for them to be out of place. And if someone's formatted it differently, that it kind of throws you off. So I think there's a good reason.
I agree. I mean, you would look at code and you get that feeling this is not right, even though the code might not have a problem. It's just the expectation of the code that is kind of a bit off. Yeah.
So let's have a talk about what tools are out there for managing and measuring code quality, because we want something a bit more objective, and we want something that's automated that we can run through code we're maintaining.
So in an ideal world, you would have a whole lot of different tools, right? That starts with analysis of your code. So you want to have something, as you said, you can actually trigger either through a UI or through command line or on a build server to run it automatically, and add maybe check-ins or something like that, that goes over your code and it gives you some sort of feedback. I mean, a lot of people do those basic things with unit tests, right? The unit tests are kind of a way to measure code quality. Not in a neutral, kind of like everyone agrees on way necessarily, because unit tests are still written by developers. Right? I mean, you write your own unit tests. So if you want to have 100% success in unit tests, you can write some really stupid unit tests and they will still pass, but it doesn't give you anything for your code quality. But the concept is the same. You basically run something in an automated way, ideally. And when you look at code analysis, there are the most common one is static analysis. So basically, you have your code sitting on a hard drive somewhere on your server, on your local development environment, and you run a tool against that code base. That tool would not execute your code. It would actually just look at your code. And that's kind of where the term static code analysis comes from, basically. It's not kind of a runtime analysis.
So it's looking for bad things in your code, or looking for syntax that's not correct, or...
Yeah, so that could be in its most basic form. It could be a compiler, right? That compiles your code, and that says, yeah, this code compiles or it doesn't compile. Really basic gag, right? So you could, in Adobe ColdFusion, there is like a compile script in there. So you could just run that for example. Or if you have an application where you initialize all your CFCs into the application scope, for example, which is still a very common thing to do in ColdFusion, that you treat the application scope as like the storage unit or the storage container for your CFCs. You could run that part of your code and basically pretty much by that compile all your CFCs and force them to be put into the application scope. And if that actually works, it doesn't throw an error, you know something about your code, right? You know that it's syntactically correct. And that's one of the problems that a lot of other languages don't have, right? For example, coming back to Java and Android and Kotlin, for example, when I build an Android app and I save my file in Android Studio, it will basically automatically give me feedback in the IDE if this is correct or not, because it has all that analysis built into IDEs. And in ColdFusion, we have much weaker tools from a development point of view. IntelliJ has a ColdFusion plugin that does some of that. So in IntelliJ's ColdFusion editor, I get some syntax problems and some kind of low level of linting provided by them. Then Adobe has something with CF Builder, which in its latest version, I think, can do some of that. But I'm not a CF Builder / Eclipse user, so it's a bit hard for me to comment on. But if you're using an editor like, let's say, Sublime or Visual Studio Code, sure, they have plugins for ColdFusion for syntax highlighting in some way or for code completion, but they wouldn't give you deeper inspection of your code. Right? And other languages have that already built into their tooling, which is a huge help. So, you know, to some extent, they rely less on tools further down the development chain, because a lot of the things can be done right away when they when that code gets written. In ColdFusion, static code analysis is particularly useful because, you know, we don't have that much deep inspection in our editors.
Mm-hmm. So as well as static analysis, what other kinds of ways of analyzing the code are there?
So you could do kind of runtime analysis, which you know, goes into scenarios like code coverage, for example. So you could actually have something that runs your code, and then you would try to find out, is all my code that I have in my code base actually being executed? You know, are there any dead branches in my code that never ever can be used? You know, and if you have stuff like that, you might want to remove that from your code base potentially.
Now, why would you want to know that code is not run? And I mean, you might want to remove it, but why else would you want to know it isn't being run?
Because again, it comes back to complexity, right? If you have code if you have a file, let's say a couple of hundred lines, and half of that is never ever been executed, I mean, why do you want to keep that around in the first place? Right? And I mean, the other reason why that could be an issue is maybe it should be run and it's not. So it could actually, you know, point out some issues in your code.
Yeah, it could be a bug that's causing it not to run, or it could be that your test suite is not exercising that piece of the code, which is a very common occurrence. That you know, when people write tests, they often don't run every. You know, you've got an if statement and it's if else, and the else bit never gets run in the test. So good to know which code is not being covered. And bugs tend to hide, just like in the apartment with the cockroaches hiding in the dark corners. The bugs in code tend to hide out in pieces of code that haven't been run.
Yeah, I fully agree. And that's something I see quite often when I deal with clients' code bases. You basically end up looking at something and ask them, like, why is this happening or not happening? And no one can really tell you, because it's been written so long ago. And it's like, yeah, that was done like 8 years ago. We have no idea anymore. The person who wrote that has left 5 years ago. You know, it's like,
Right. And another common reason I think is duplicate code. I don't know if you come across that much in your work, but
yeah, sometimes I do. You probably find that a lot within applications that do not have a framework, or where people move from legacy code towards some kind of a framework in a non-ideal way. Where basically individual pages or individual templates just have duplicate stuff on them.
Yeah.
And then let's say they made the move from there to use a framework, but maybe they copied those already duplicate bits into more duplicate places in the framework, which didn't really help to alleviate the problem.
Right, because then when you're maintaining it, you don't know which piece of code you're supposed to edit,
Yeah, I mean, there are easy ways out for that, right? You could, the most simplest refactoring is find all the duplicate bits and move them into a shared CFC function or something like that. I mean, it's not even hard to fix necessarily. It just someone needs to take ownership of a problem like that and just do it. Usually, that's what I find.
So what other areas do tools work on?
So we had like static and runtime analysis. I mean, another thing I really like for improving code quality are code reviews. Just basically taking the idea from agile extreme programming, which is basically peer programming, or one part of that is peer programming, and taking that out of the actual development part, but look at it in a later stage. So even if for the people who don't know, basically peer programming in XP essentially means you're not sitting in front of your computer alone by yourself. You're sitting there with a peer. So two of you, both developers, or maybe a developer and a QA or testing person sometimes, if they're close to code, would work together on a problem for half a day or a day on one machine. So you sit next to each other, one person is kind of driving and using the keyboard and writing code, and the other person is kind of observing and commenting and basically making suggestions, or basically pointing out issues. And then after half an hour or an hour, you would swap roles. The other person would be driving, and the original developer would actually move into a commenting and observing role. So if you take that concept to a point like where the code has been written, code review becomes kind of quite useful, right? Because you can do code review in kind of a peer way. So you could say, right, so this code has been written by someone, let's say by me, and I would like to initiate a code review of that. So I ask some of my teammates to have a look at that code. And there are tools to kind of, do that, where you basically have a management tool for your code repository, and you would say, this commit or this series of change sets, or maybe, these lines, like 100 lines in your code or whatever, mark them in some way and then invite other people to review them. And that's a great way to improve your code quality, because you get other developers of your team to explicitly look at your code and to provide feedback. The important thing is with those kind of things, you need to provide feedback in a positive way. Or you need, that's the wrong way to express it. What you really need to do is you need to conduct those code reviews in a positive way. You can't go in there and say like, well, this is, stupid and wrong and broken, throw it all away, redo it from scratch. As much as you would like to sometimes, right? But you kind of need to focus on the positive things, basically, and you need to you pretty much have to have a code of conduct for doing those code reviews, right? So the people who provide feedback can't be dicks, basically, and the people who ask for feedback need to understand that some of the feedback they get potentially might hurt their professional feelings, because you still need to be honest, right? You need to be able to say like, well, I don't like this because this causes these problems further down the chain, for example, right? Or this should be, if you write it this way, it would be 10 times more effective or faster. So you have to, when you engage in those code reviews on either side, you have to kind of swallow a bit of your professional pride and at least accept feedback. And then in a worst case scenario, say, all right, I disagree. I'm not implementing your feedback, but you can't be, you can't be angry about other people's feedback if it was given in a professional and objective way.
Mm-hmm. It's basically taking your egos out of the equation. So
yeah, pretty much, yeah.
So, which is always a good thing for writing code, not to have your ego involved.
And there are a few tools that are really good for that. I use an open source code repository management tool called Rhodecode quite a bit. And that's particularly nice because it's platform independent from a repo point of view. So you can host Git and Mercurial on it. And people can run it on their own servers. So I've got a few clients who are very particular about where their code lives. So they don't like to be on GitHub, for example, or Bitbucket. They want to be in-house behind a VPN. So we use that tool in those instances. And that has code review functionality built in. Another tool that is really good is a platform called Upsource from Jetbrains. Jetbrains are the people who do IntelliJ and TeamCity, which is an automation build server, and a whole bunch of other developer-centric tools. And Upsource basically hooks into your repository. You still need to have somewhere. But then it allows you to initiate and manage those code reviews and track changes over time and track feedback from other people. So that's a very specific tool for that purpose.
And any of those tools also make it easy to tell which code has been code reviewed or are there pieces of code that haven't been reviewed.
Yeah, exactly. And that would be in there. Rhodecode wouldn't have that much of deep specific functionality into that. So in Rhodecode, you can't easily say those 27 lines wouldn't have been reviewed because it's more a repository management tool that has kind of review functionality bolted onto it, really. Yeah, but other tools have. And I mean, there's way more, just like in the section of code review, probably like 5 to 10 really good tools out there that you could, depending on your platform and your requirements, find to do that kind of thing.
There's also a company called SmartBear that makes code review tools. I don't know if they work with ColdFusion. I imagine they do. But
I've heard the name SmartBear before, but I don't think I know any of their tools. Or not out of my head, anyway.
Well, we'll check into those after the episode, but I'll put a link in the show notes for anyone intrigued by that. I met the founder of SmartBear a few months back and learned some things about it.
Okay.
So what about I know there are a few other things you talked about on this code correctness. Tell us about that.
Well, code correctness is essentially if you have a spec for your code, which unfortunately a lot of people don't even have, that you want to test that your code basically behaves according to the spec. And that's kind of the idea of unit testing, taking a bit more to an abstract level. So you wouldn't really do that low-level developer testing, but you would essentially have potentially a spec that is written in something that is close to natural language. This function should, blah, blah, or when this button is clicked, another window should pop up, stuff like that. And there are a bunch of tools that allow you to write those specs, and they usually come from the behavior-driven development movement, BDD. And then those specs could be used to test if basically code does what it's supposed to do.
And then what about complexity? Is there a way to measure that with some tool? Or?
There are a bunch of metrics for complexity in code. And when Michael and I spoke before the episode, he pointed out there is a project on GitHub that I didn't know about that actually measures the McCabe index for ColdFusion code from Nathan Strons, I think. So I'm going to have a look into that. It seems to be it's a couple of years old, but it definitely looks interesting, and the link will be in the show notes. So I mean, yeah, there are metrics for code complexity, and apparently there is a tool for CFML that looks at least into one of those metrics. With those metrics, you always need to be a bit careful because they can easily throw you off as well. You know, it's like a single number is not necessarily the best indicator of your code quality. You know, there's much more playing into that. Right. But you know, that kind of number can give you an indication. I mean, as an example, my wife is doing a lot of work around stakeholder engagement in large organizations, and particularly around web content. And they use tools to measure readability of normal text, of written text for the web, basically. And they have a bunch of amazing tools. I was just recently introduced to some of that, basically, where you chuck in your text, your blog post, or your article, or whatever, and it basically gives you a really simple figure, like which grade in school would you need to be to understand this text. And that's actually, when you think about it, that's an amazing metric, right? Because it's like, okay, you know, you have to be in grade 24 in high school to understand this text, which pretty much means like it's totally unreadable, you know. Or versus you have to be in grade 8, then, you know, if you publish it on the web, maybe for like a tech audience, everyone should be able to read that, ideally. And, you know, if we had something like that in programming, that would be cool. And some of those metrics try to do that, but you still have to be a bit careful because, you know, a number is a very, very thin thing to base your decisions on. I mean, I think in code, a lot of additional things play into it, but it gives you a really good indication of, you know, how good or how bad something might be.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the thing to do is to get the number, the McCabe index or the complexity index or whatever. And if it's bad, it would be good to justify why you wrote the code that way.
Yeah.
But if it's okay, you don't need to look into it any further.
Yeah.
And then the final thing on this that you wrote down ahead of time was cyclic dependency. Tell us what that is and how that relates to quality.
Yeah, so if you have a system that comprises of individual parts, let's say like modules or, you know, CFCs or classes or packages. I mean, it doesn't really matter on which level you look at that. What you ideally do not want are cyclic dependencies, you know, that A depends on B depends on C depends on B again, and, you know, in a worst case scenario, B depends on A, because it basically means like you can't decouple them. They are so tightly coupled in cyclic dependencies. So that means like if you, to run A, you need B, but to run B, you need A. Where do you start, right? And that can cause lots of issues, for example, for object instantiation. If you have cycles in those dependencies, it's like, well, what do I create first if I need those 10 objects? Right? How do I set that up? And it becomes really, really messy. So ideally, you want to have dependency graphs that are not cyclic, right? That basically go in one direction from top to bottom, bottom to top, however you want to draw them. Because then your code is automatically less coupled. And, you know, loosely coupled code in general is preferable over strongly coupled code.
And then how do you generate a dependency graph? Is there a tool for that? Or
there are a bunch of homegrown tools. I've written a few specific ones for use cases for my clients, for example. I've got one client that have a lot of CFCs, and we wanted to have a look at, like, you know, how do they all belong together? And what we were basically just doing is look at inheritance specifications, look at the different ways how they instantiate code inside of other CFCs, basically. So you would say like, oh, okay, there's a create object statement. So you would parse the code. You would try to find all the places where new code is spawn off, and then you basically generate a graph based off that. And then you discover like, oh, okay, there are all those cycles. And I mean, after you have like a map of your dependencies, creating graphs is the easiest part, because there are tons of really good like open source graphing tools out there. If you have like a text file in a certain format, for example, it will draw a graph for you. And if you go with the right tools, it will tell you automatically if there are cycles, what the largest cycle is, what the smallest cycle is. And I mean, there are tons of things that those tools give you if you have a map of your dependencies. So you have to create.
What's your favorite tool for graphing these things?
It depends a bit on the use case. I mean, there are a bunch of Java or Python tools people have written that you can use for that. And I can put maybe 1 or 2 links in the show note of stuff that is in general useful. But really, everyone's requirements are so different. It's hard to, say like this is the best thing, because those command line tools as well. They have to fit into your infrastructure, right? I mean, you want to have something that ideally goes with other stuff you're doing or that you're running anyway.
So let's look at why there aren't so many tools in the ColdFusion community for code quality.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, or a good point, right? Like, for a start, that is a fact, actually. When you look at the list of tools you find for other languages, the ColdFusion community doesn't have a lot. And I think part of the reason is that historically, the ColdFusion community comes out of a community of people who just wanted to build a dynamic website back in the day. And it was never it was never as mature and as like professional as, for example, the Java community. Or professional is probably the wrong word. It's more formal. Formal is probably a better word, right? So because ColdFusion developers do a professional job, regardless if they use tools or not, it's just on a different level, basically, right? I mean, you can build a good ColdFusion application from a business point of view without using any of those tools. I mean, that's still a professional job. But, Java developers or people in the .NET world approach things maybe a bit more formal and a bit more from the point of view of building a large and potentially complex system. And I think historically, you probably find a lot of people in the ColdFusion community haven't been professionally trained computer scientists, if that makes sense. A lot of people who got into that platform came from like a different background, or they came from a business background and just used ColdFusion to build something quickly, or they are self-taught web developers or front-end devs who got into using a tag to do some back-end work. I mean, there are tons of reasons, and there are computer scientists in ColdFusion as well, obviously, right? But I think the mix in the ColdFusion scene is a bit different than it is in Java or in .NET land, basically. And that certainly contributes to the lack of those tools. The other problem, and that's me blaming the vendor, is that starting from Alea back in the day, over Macromedia, over Adobe, have never shown an interest in building any of those tools for the community. And to be fair, they shouldn't necessarily have to provide everything, but it's kind of, like Adobe nowadays is more or less mainly interested in selling the server, and off you go and you do whatever you want with it at the end of the day. And they're not really interested in providing a lot of tooling around that and fostering kind of a more professional development practice. So a lot of that stuff has to come from the community, and some of it is, basically. But the ColdFusion community is smaller than, for example, the Java or .NET community, let's say, or the Ruby community. So you have less people interested in building tools, and it's just less momentum, essentially.
Well, and maybe conferences like CF Camp, where you're going to be speaking in a few weeks, are a place to have this kind of discussion. And certainly on the CF Alive podcast, that's one of the things we look at. How can we make ColdFusion a modern, successful language?
Yeah, and I think, having better development tools is just one of those steps to make it a better platform. From a language point of view. I mean, I know it's easy to mix ColdFusion as a language and the product and stuff like that. I would probably want to call it like we could make CF or CFML a better technology platform by doing that, really, for everyone. And ideally server agnostic. It should be working with Lucy and Adobe CF. Blue Dragon, I'm not really sure about how active that project still is, but at least
not very active. The main projects are Lucy and Adobe ColdFusion. Yeah. So what's the coolest tool you've seen in other languages, Kai, that you wish was available for ColdFusion?
I think although the most useful tool probably would be a very comprehensive tool in static analysis. And we're trying to provide that or work on something like that with CF Lint, which is basically a static analysis tool for CFML. But we are a very small group of people, and we are very opinionated. So, it might not be the ideal tool for everyone, but it's a start at the end of the day, basically.
Well, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But first, let's just have an overview of what tools are out there for ColdFusion code quality.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that is out there is like a Vasko. That was written years ago, and essentially what it does is basically it runs over your code, it checks if you have any violations for locally scoped variables and functions. So you're not using the var keyword, essentially, in a nutshell. But that tool was written really long ago, probably more than 10 years ago. And it had its focus on CFML tag code. So when CF script came up and like all those modern changes to the CFML language in recent years, that kind of got left behind. And a few people have provided fixes for that, but they never got accepted into the main Vasko project. So I think Vasko nowadays has become quite stale, and probably a better solution if you use Vasko now would be to move to CF Lint, because we've got Vascoping rules in there as well. The problem with Vasko is it's also not using a proper parser. So it's basically parsing your code with regular expressions. And that's, in general, not the greatest way to do it. Then another tool, I didn't want to interrupt you. Another tool is like CF Query Param Checker. And we can have a look for the link and put that into show notes as well. And that's another common problem, that people write SQL code in CF query tags, and they don't use CF Query Param to protect the SQL code from injections. And so there is a checking tool for that. Again, I would probably say if you run that tool for that purpose, you should instead move to CF Lint and use the specific rules we provide in CF Lint for that, because that will just give you a whole bunch of additional functionality around this.
And tell us a little bit about CF Lint,
Yeah, CF Lint basically came out of the CF Parser project. So there's a guy called Ryan Eberly in the US, and he started CF Parser and CF Lint. And CF Parser is basically an ANTLR-based CFML parser, and ANTLR is kind of a compiler generation tool, very well known in the Java world, like a compiler or parser generator. And so he used ANTLR to parse CFML code into a proper tree structure, into a proper parser structure. And then CF Lint is kind of an offspawn of that, using that parsed CFML code to actually run checking rules against it. And so CF Parser and CF Lint are both not brand new. They've been around for like 3-4 years, something like that. And I got kind of involved with CF Lint at some stage last year for the first time, 2016, because I started using it and I found a few issues or a few problems in my own code or in client's code that were false positives, or things that CF Lint at the time couldn't check. So I started providing feedback and change requests and log bugs, and then kind of stuck around and started to do things basically. So CF Lint uses CF Parser. They are individual projects, but they're kind of like, to run CF Lint, you need to have like a version of CF Parser compiled or embedded into your code. And if you only want to run CF Lint, that's perfectly fine. You will never know there's a CF Parser thing in the background, but it's 2 individual bits. And CF Lint comes as a command line tool. You basically say, hey, this is the code I want to check. And then by default, it runs like a whole lot of rules. And you can obviously say, I want to run just a few of those rules or all of them, or I want to exclude certain rules in certain directories. And then it kind of checks your code, essentially.
And it gives you some feedback on where you have problems, or?
Yeah, so basically it will provide results it can provide results in various output formats. So we have an HTML output, so it gives you a nice, not pretty, it gives you a workable web page, basically, with all the results. And the result would be basically, it would give you the file name, the violated rule, the line number, and in some instances, the column number, and it would give you a line of the code, where the problem basically is. And you'll see it quite quickly, or you get a feeling for quite quickly what to look for. It's like, if you have a CF query param violation, we give you the CF query line in ColdFusion code. So you have to look into the query and find yourself where the problem is potentially, but that's kind of how it works. So HTML is one output format. The other output format is we have an internal CF Lint XML format that you can just go with and do whatever you like with. We've got a JSON output, which gives you a JSON object, and we support findbugs, kind of a quite technology universal standard coming from the Java world. Findbugs is a Java tool, essentially, that is kind of a code analysis result tool that exists for Java, for .NET, for tons of platforms, and you can import it into version control servers and yada, yada, yada. You can do all those things.
Cool. And what exciting things are you looking to add to CF Lint this year?
So we've got actually a bit of a roadmap. So we have currently released 1.2 that was done a few weeks ago, and we had a few bug fix releases since then. So we've got now 1.21 or 1.22 or something like that. 1.3 will be the next minor release that's coming out, and for that we're not gonna make any massive changes. The changes will be working through a bunch of tickets and making a few smaller preparations for bigger work coming in 2.0. And 2.0 will basically feature a new output generator, because currently the various output formats are done internally in a lot of different ways. The HTML output is created one way, the findbugs XML output is created in a different way, and I want to reunify all of that basically and have one output component that actually manages that all in a nicer way.
So you're improving the code quality of CF Lint itself.
Yeah, funny enough, actually, that's exactly what it is, basically. I should explain that as well. CF Lint is written in Java currently, so it's not written in ColdFusion, basically. So, so we're writing basically Java code. And because a whole bunch of people have contributed over the years, as it happens with projects like that, people do things in a different way. And we decided for 2.0, we want to unify some of those things and streamline some of the code. The other thing we're doing in 2.0 is working or doing more work towards an API. And the idea of that is we want to make CF Lint more accessible for people who build tools. So I want to basically enable CF Lint to be used in IDEs. Ideally. So, because right now it's a command line tool, and a lot of the logic and the way how results are created are basically geared towards command line. So you run it against your code base, or you run it automatically if you want to. But what we ideally would want is have some sort of an integration point where an IDE author or plugin author could say, I want to run CF Lint kind of as a background process, for example, in your IDE, right? As soon as you type, I want my code to be CFLinted for that file or for that content, right? And to do that, we need to change a bunch of things, how CFLint is handling stuff internally to provide those kind of like CFLint API points. And we're not talking about a REST API. We're mainly talking about a Java API that other people can use, because currently it really only has a command line API.
And could that also mean that you could call it in a continuous integration script, so that when you check in code, you can do that now?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can do that already, basically. And that's how a lot of people use it, basically, because it's command line. As soon as you can run something like a Windows command prompt or like a Unix bash or Mac bash or something like that together with your integration server, you're fine. And most integration servers I know can do that.
And then does it give some kind of return code telling you the quality of the code, or? Well,
it gives you, it gives you inspection results. That's what it's usually called, right? So, for example, in TeamCity, that's the integration server I use quite a bit for clients. You would run CFLint as find bugs, as a find bugs report, because TeamCity supports that format, so that's the easiest thing to do. So you run it, and CFLint would create a results file in findbugs XML. And then that results file automatically gets picked up by TeamCity, and it shows it on the build report for that particular build as code inspections. And then based on that, you could make decisions. You could say like, all right, if there's any number of code inspections larger than 0, I fail the build, because I want CFLint to report nothing. If it does, then my build is not okay. That's one way of looking at it. The other thing that you could do is you could say, well, I might have a whole bunch of problems in my code right now, and I know about that. Let's say if I run CFLint, I get 100 inspection results right now. And some of them are things I know I need to change at some point, but I just can't do that now. You could set up TeamCity in a way that it says, all right, if the number of inspections found in a certain branch of your repository increases, then we fail the build. So if you're in branch A, like a feature, and you had 100 code inspections, you produce new ones by writing code that fails CFLint tests, it will fail the build. But as long as your code inspections stay at 100, it will pass the build. And like TeamCity, for instance, can track that by branch. So in another branch, B, for example, we could have 150 code inspections right now. And the rule could be, if that increases, I fail the build. If it stays 150, I pass the build.
So you can look at the growth in the badness of the code. And if it gets too smelly, then you reject it.
Exactly. Or you could actually even make it a percentage rule. You could say, like, if the number of inspections increases by more than 5%, we fail the build, or something like that.
Sounds really interesting. How do people get hold of CFLint?
Well, there is a GitHub repository, which will be in the show notes. And you can do different things. On the GitHub repository, there is a releases page, and you can just download a zip file. That's the easiest way to get going. That zip file will contain a jar, and you run that jar, Java command line, java -jar, and then specify some command line parameters. We also have a quite big README file on the GitHub page, or the start page of the GitHub repository is actually a README file. That is contains some basic documentation. It has examples how to run it, how to include and exclude rules, and how to just get going in the most simplest way. There used to be a wiki, but we found that the wiki became stale over time. And we find it's actually a better way to provide documentation as part of the repository, because then, when you release a new version, you update the documentation, and the documentation actually matches your tool at any time. And it's not like an old wiki page from 2 years ago that has nothing to do with how the tool works anymore. So we changed that recently. So the documentation is currently really up to date. And we are actually a quite friendly bunch of people. We have a code of conduct in our project. We try to be nice to people when they need help, and we expect people to be nice to us when they ask for help. And that kind of seems to be working so far.
An open source code of conduct.
Yeah, I would recommend that for any open source project, really, because it sets the tone a little bit. And I don't know, I find that useful nowadays, basically.
I think that's useful in any community.
Yeah, it is. And I used the code of conduct of a conference here in New Zealand as a starting point when I wrote that. The conference is called WebStock, and it's one of the nicest and friendliest web conferences I've pretty much ever been to, really. And their code of conduct is pretty much like, it comes down to don't be a dick, really. And that's, ideally, that's all you need, right? But then I basically extended it a bit and tried to explain, what we want to do and what we expect, and how people, how we expect people to behave, and how to, how to act if they feel violated or threatened or uncomfortable, basically, what to do about it. So, yeah. And
yeah, I think it's really important. I've been involved in writing several of those kind of documents. I was involved in one for an intentional community, and then I've just helped out an entrepreneur community with their community guidelines, which is similar concept.
Have a look at the CF Lint code of conduct if you like. And I'm totally keen on any feedback to improve it and make it better, basically, if you can think.
Yeah, happy to look at it. So, anything else on CF Flint you want to share with us?
No, that's probably good for now. Make sure you come to my talk if you're at CF Camp to actually see it in action and get a few more technical examples of how you set up stuff. And I'm also going to be showing how to compile and how to contribute to it, or at least do some basic contributions for a start.
Fabulous. And then are there any other tools that help with code quality, like documentation? Or
there are a bunch of documentation tools. There is ColdDoc that Mark Mandel wrote ages ago, I think together when he did the Cold Spring library, probably. But that's not being maintained a lot anymore. The Autos guys have done a documentation tool called DocBox, I think, which I haven't played with myself yet, but that looks, we know that when it comes out of Autos, it's usually a good tool. So that would be worthwhile looking at. That is, all those documentation tools cover a very certain aspect of code quality, though, only, right? They cover documentation quality, or they cover the fact that you want to have documentation in your code that you can use to create something that can be read outside of your code. And the interesting bit about that is it changes the way how you write documentation, from my experience. Because if you know that what you write in your code as documentation gets extracted and formatted in some other output, you automatically spend more effort on documentation, I like to think, or that's my experience with different teams, at least. And that's a good thing. So even if you, realistically, if you never want to look at that documentation again in an extracted format, just basically creating it usually improves the standard of the documentation you get from people.
Right, because they know it's going to be looked for.
Yeah.
So what are there any other things that help out with code quality? Or
that's pretty much it. Individual people have probably written their own little tools to do certain things, like I've done with that cyclic analysis for some clients. Or you look at very specific use cases, like trying to find if certain tags are used in a certain way. But mostly I find people don't make those little tools public and available. I mean, I know they exist, or little, deployment scripts or other checking tools, and they exist usually behind firewalls or in internal code repositories or on individual developers' hard drives in a temp directory. And it's a shame that a lot of those things never see the light of public, because I always like to think like, any tool is better than no tool, even if it's just like written in 20 minutes at the site. And there's always someone who can make use of something and improve it and use it for their own, their own benefit. So I would love if people make those little things more accessible and more available, but it's kind of a hard thing to break into. It's hard to convince people that it's worthwhile doing that, from my experience.
Would you be open to people sending you their secret tools to check out?
Totally. Yeah. If I'd be even happy to, put them all into a repository on GitHub if people have no idea how to use GitHub and don't know about open source coding and, what to do with that. If anyone sends me something, I'm more than happy to put it on a GitHub repository and credit them. I really don't care about, my ownership of that. It's like, I just want to get it out there that people can do stuff with it.
Okay, so hope everyone listening who's got secret code quality tools hiding in their servers, if they can just send them to Kai.
Exactly. Yeah.
He'll help get them out there.
Depending on what it is, we might be able to include the idea at least into CF Lint. And I mean, there are tons of ways how you can create synergies between those existing things and stuff that we are doing anyway. And I mean, yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm excited about CF Lint and your talk at Code Camp, but let's switch gears a bit now, and I want to ask you why you're proud to use ColdFusion.
Oh, that's an interesting question, and I was actually, I'm listening to your podcast, so I knew that question was coming, and I was actually thinking for quite a while, like, what would I answer to that? And I would probably say, I'm not, but that obviously needs to have a qualifier, right? I think for me personally, the question is worded the wrong way, right? I'm not proud to use ColdFusion in the same way how I'm not proud to be an Android developer or proud to use JavaScript or whatever, right? I think from a technology point of view, ColdFusion has its place, right? It's a good technology for certain use cases. When you want to build an application really quickly, you need to get going, you want to build something that can be nowadays be released rapidly and is still maintainable, and that integrates with other Java technologies, for example. So for me, it's more about finding a good use case for CF or Lucy as a technology platform. But at the same time, in a lot of cases, like ColdFusion doesn't make sense from my point of view, or Lucy doesn't make sense, right? Like the most typical example is CF Mobile, that thing that Adobe released a while ago, that you can build a mobile app out of ColdFusion backend code. That's just a terrible idea. It was a terrible idea from the get-go, and it's still a terrible idea, and no one's using it. And everyone told Adobe that, right? So, when you look at that, it's like you need to find the right tool for the job. And just because ColdFusion can do one thing or some things really good, it doesn't mean it should be used for everything. So coming back to the question, I'm not proud to use ColdFusion. I think ColdFusion is a really good technology for certain use cases, and you need to basically use it in the right instances. Like that's probably the best answer on that.
Great. So I know some people have said in years past that ColdFusion was dying, and I think that's not the case. But my question to you, Kai, is what would it take to make ColdFusion more alive this year?
I think there are so many things you could do, to be honest, right? I mean, we talked about some of them already, right? Like have better developer tools. That's one thing. The other thing is ColdFusion is in a difficult position from a market point of view, because it's a web development platform that Adobe wants a lot of money for. And people don't really understand why that is, for good reasons, right? Because if I want to build a web app, I can use Node or Rails or even Java or .NET or whatever, and I don't have to pay anything. So if Adobe would want ColdFusion to be more widespread, the first thing would be they have to release a free or ideally an open source version that basically cuts off that whole enterprise stuff that's in there, like, PDF forms and maybe, the SMS messaging gateway and all that stuff that to build a normal web app, you really don't need, right? And just make it available. At the same time, or in the same direction, it would be awesome if Lucy would get more publicity, right? Because, they have a really good free open source CFML server that is in a lot of ways better than Adobe ColdFusion is from, a performance point of view, for instance, and also in some ways from a language point of view. And surely Lucy gets some traction, but, it should be tenfold larger ideally by now, right? From a community point of view and from a usage point of view. And it's a perception problem because people perceive ColdFusion and CFML as a dying thing, right? So we're basically stuck in a chicken egg loop a little bit from that point of view. To be fair, though, Adobe has been trying to do certain things. They have that university curriculum. The downside of that is, however, that it's extremely hard or impossible to get to that and to get it in the first place. And then you still need ColdFusion, which is a commercial product, even though there are educational licenses. So it's kind of like a lot of it revolves back to ColdFusion costing quite a lot of money for someone who wants to build a website, because they can do that for free and as fast as in ColdFusion in 10 other technologies nowadays. So that's a big issue. I said on Twitter a while ago, in an ideal world, autos should buy ColdFusion from Adobe, because they are actually driving a lot of the innovation in the CFML community. And you can't, if you're a CF developer or CFML developer, you should definitely have a look at least some of the box tools, even if you're not a code box person, which is totally fair enough. Have a look at the tools around CodeBox, Testbox and Mockbox and DocBox, and there's so many
command box.
Command box, to mention that, or they have a tool for configuration now, and there's so many things those guys are doing, which are really, really great, right? And it's awesome to see that innovation coming from a third-party company. But given the lack of innovation coming out of Adobe in some ways, it would be lovely, if others could just buy ColdFusion and just run with it, and we would have a much better product, I think.
Maybe they could go even further and just buy Adobe.
Yeah, that's maybe a bit too ambitious for now, but yeah, in the long run, who knows?
Well, great. So you're going to be speaking at CF Camp. What are you looking forward to at it?
A bunch of things. For me, it's kind of a bit of a family homecoming meeting, to be honest. The talk's are obviously interesting, but I really enjoy it as an opportunity to meet my friends from the European CF community or CFML community, which I don't get to see that often, basically. And CF Camp has become one of the conferences I plan to go to reasonably early in the year. So as soon as it comes to kind of February, March, I usually try to secretly get the date out of Michi and plan my trip in advance to make sure that I can actually make the dates. And what is actually kind of nice is it's usually not far away from another conference I want to go to in London, which is DroidCon UK. So this year, this is the week after CF Camp. So I can just go to Europe once, go to CF Camp, then hang out a few days, and then go to London to DroidCon and fly back home to New Zealand. So it's kind of like
perfect.
One go.
And I noticed you're learning how to fly your own small plane. Are you going to fly yourself to CF Camp one year?
Yeah, that would be lovely. No, that's probably never going to happen. So, I mean, yeah, I've got a pilot's license for private use, like a PPL. But it's for light single engine and light twins. So I would already struggle making it to Australia, basically. People have done that. People have crossed the Tasman Sea to Australia with light aircraft, but usually it involves like island hopping. So you would go from New Zealand to one island, then to another island, then to Australia. It's like a 2 or 3 day trip. And it's actually, even if you do that, it's kind of dangerous, because if you think about like, you have a single combustion engine and you're flying over an ocean for like 5 or 6 hours each leg, it's kind of like, yeah, I'm not sure if I want to do that, basically.
Yeah, but once you get to Australia, you can just hop over Indonesia and just fly over Asia. You'll be in Germany before you know it.
You totally can do that. People do those world trips, right? But when you actually read the books or the trip reports of the trip, it takes them probably like 3 months to do that. It would be cool though, but it's kind of like, yeah, not really realistic to do that, I think.
Okay. Well, thanks for being on the podcast today, Kai.
Thanks for having me. That was really cool. Awesome.